as far as alleged murderers go, Bryan Kohberger is one of the most sophisticated I've seen in my more than 20 years of practice.
Since accused killer Bryan Kohberger's arrest late last year, many questions remain in the University of Idaho quadruple murder case. But experts now tell us new bombshell information could be revealed at Kohberger's preliminary hearing.
I think we will learn a lot at the preliminary hearing because there's different types of homicide. Here we're talking about first degree murder. That generally is premeditated murder. Typical examples sort of lying in wait. And of course, that is what the prosecution is charging here. And that's why Bryan Kohberger is not even eligible for bail under Idaho laws.
On November 13th, 2022, four University of Idaho students were found stabbed to death in their off-campus home. After weeks of a nationwide manhunt, suspected killer Bryan Kohberger was arrested just before the new year.
Detectives arrested 28-year-old Bryan Christopher Kohberger in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, on a warrant for murders of Ethan, Zana, Madison, and Kaylee.
At the time of his arrest, Kohberger was at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. He was later extradited to Idaho, where he's been in jail for the last 3 months. He appeared in Latah County Court in early January, where he was formally charged with all 4 murders.
It alleges that the defendant, Bryan C. Kohberger, on or about November 13th of 2022, in Latah County, state of Idaho, did unlawfully enter a residence located at 1122 King Road, Moscow, with the intent to commit the felony crime of murder.
Since Kohberger's January court appearances, we haven't heard much about the accused killer, but we can expect to learn a lot more at his preliminary hearing this summer.
Usually preliminary hearings are done within a day or a few hours, but obviously this is not an ordinary case. This is a quadruple murder, and a lot of the evidence hasn't been revealed because of the gag order and because we're dealing with search warrants in 3 states.
A gag order was issued in Kohberger's case early on, meaning a lot of information about the case is still under lock and seal. Former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani tells Law&Crime Network it's one of the most intense gag orders he's ever seen.
This is one of the broadest gag orders I've ever seen. It covers the attorneys, parties, and the victims. You don't typically see that. I think the magistrate judge in this case wanted to be overly cautious.
But there is likely a reason behind the strict order.
The Supreme Court has generally upheld gag orders when they're necessary to protect the rights of a criminal defendant. And we know that in death penalty cases, the defense actually has a better chance of getting a death sentence overturned on appeal than they do with actually getting a not guilty verdict or a life sentence when it comes to a jury, especially in a case like this.
More than 30 news organizations have petitioned the court to have that gag order lifted. Kohberger's defense team is pushing back, calling the media's coverage of the case, quote, twisted in court documents filed with the Idaho Supreme Court. But according to Rahmani, even with a gag order still in place, we can expect new details to come out at the preliminary hearing.
I expect to see sort of 4 broad categories of information. Obviously, the scene of the murders, the home in Idaho. We're going to hear a lot of evidence what was found there. Some of that's already come out. Obviously, Bryan Kohberger's car, that white Hyundai Elantra, we know that's important because that was law enforcement's key piece of evidence. That's what they asked the public to help them out with.
Before a suspect was named in the case, the Moscow Police Department announced they were searching for a white Hyundai Elantra, naming it a vehicle of interest.
We are confident that the occupant or occupants of that vehicle have information that's critical to this investigation.
When investigators executed a search warrant at Kohberger's parents' home, they recovered multiple items from his white Hyundai Elantra, including goggles, hiking boots, a shovel, and a wrench.
I would really like to see, and this is very sad to say, but is any of the victims' blood in that white Hyundai Elantra in Kohberger's apartment at his parents' home? Something more to connect him to the scene of the crime, because of course we know that the self-site evidence really stopped, right? Either he put his phone in airplane mode or he turned it off or he left it somewhere. Really the only evidence that really kind of puts him at the scene of the crime that we've heard so far is just that single source DNA in the knife sheath. And if you want to put someone to death for the state of Idaho, you really want some more evidence than that.
Because of the nature of Kohberger's charges, he could face the death penalty if convicted. Law&Crime Network host and public defender Bryan Kohberger says the prosecution will likely use the preliminary hearing to decide how to move forward.
They're probably looking to see what the court of public opinion thinks after the preliminary hearing. Because even though it's not Florida, they looked at the Parkland shooter and that person didn't get the death penalty. And if you can kill 17 people and injure 17 more and still have life in prison, then the argument for all defense attorneys would be, why shouldn't Bryan Kohberger also get life in prison? But I think after we hear about the heinousness of this crime, the prosecution will kind of get a temperature reading on the court of public opinion. And then based on when they have to make that announcement, because you often have to do that before trial, that's when we may or may not hear if they're seeking the death penalty.
Romani says Idaho's law is unique in that both the defendant's plea and the prosecution's decision to pursue the death penalty comes after a preliminary hearing.
Well, Idaho is unique in that there's no arraignment until after the preliminary hearing. So most states and in the federal system as well, once a defendant is arrested, he or she is brought into court and they plead guilty or not guilty. Well, Idaho, that plea doesn't happen until after the preliminary hearing. But really, I think what the prosecution is preparing for is after the preliminary hearing. So assuming the magistrate judge finds probable cause, then Bryan Kohberger will be transferred from magistrate court to district court. And that's where a senior judge will actually oversee the jury trial. Then Bryan Kohberger will plead. I assume he's going to plead not guilty. And the prosecution has 60 days to give notice of whether they're going to seek the death penalty.
After Kohberger's arrest, a probable cause affidavit was unsealed, revealing that a single source of male DNA was discovered on a knife sheath left behind at the crime scene. When compared with DNA from the trash recovered at Kohberger's parents' home, there was a near-perfect match. But should the prosecution pursue the death penalty, Romani says they would need to present more DNA evidence than we've seen so far.
That's probably not enough to put someone to death because the defense is going to be able to argue that this DNA was transferred, and there's probably a lot more DNA in this house. It's reportedly a party house. People are coming and going. You really want something more than just one source of DNA if you're going to convince 12 out of 12 jurors, not only return a guilty verdict, to return a death sentence. So hopefully if you're the state and for these victims, there's a lot more evidence than what's been publicly reported so far.
And based on past high-profile cases in Idaho, Romani believes prosecutors will ultimately seek the death penalty.
I fully expect this to be a death penalty case for a few reasons. First, we know that public defender Ann Taylor is one of about a dozen or so death penalty qualified lawyers in the state of Idaho that can handle a death penalty trial as a first chair. In addition, the defense has requested a second death penalty qualified lawyer. And of course, we know how Idaho prosecutors have handled other cases. The probably most famous one that's happening right now is the doomsday cult couple, Chad and Lori Daybell, who allegedly killed their kids and buried them in the backyard. Prosecutors are seeking a death penalty in that case, and I expect them to be consistent and seek the death penalty for Bryan Kohberger.
But before all that, we can expect a days-long preliminary hearing.
A preliminary hearing is like what we call a mini trial. It's a lower standard of proof, so they're not proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And they're going to put on as much evidence as they need to kind of meet that threshold of saying, Judge, we have enough here, let's go to trial. I expect a 4-day, maybe a full work week's worth of a preliminary hearing, because yes, you have 4 murders. Yes, you have all of this circumstantial evidence, all of this forensics that not just places Kohberger inside the apartment, but how they actually tracked him down. Because they don't just have to prove that the murders occurred, they have to prove that Bryan Kohberger is the one that did it. So I would buckle up for a very long and probably technical preliminary hearing.
In the multiple days of the hearing, Kohberger believes we're bound to learn more about the murders.
In the preliminary hearing, I would bet 100% we're going to hear new facts that we have not heard from these search warrants. Because one, the prosecution is still doing an investigation. There may be more information that they found out since his arrest that they're not going to present. But the prosecution will not let, quote unquote, the cat out of the bag completely. They're not going to show all of their cards because then the defense has a longer amount of time to prepare. So they're going to show just enough to show the judge, this can go to trial, a jury needs to decide this. But I think just enough is going to be a lot more than we've heard so far.
Romani agrees, saying the prosecution won't give the defense a roadmap of their case. Rather, they will call witnesses strategically. He says most of the witnesses will likely be law enforcement involved in the investigation, but others could be called to the stand as well.
Potentially, and this is where the strategy comes into play, the prosecution may want to present some lay witnesses, civilians. Now, to do that, you really want to make sure that they don't testify in a way that might be inconsistent at trial, right? So it's testimony under oath. So if you have concerns about a witness that may testify differently, you might not want to put them on the stand if you're the prosecution. However, if you're concerned that a witness might be unavailable or you want to lock in their testimony, that might be a reason to have that witness testify at the preliminary hearing.
While the defense could call witnesses, Romani says that isn't likely.
They're just trying to get that free evidence that, obviously they have the discovery, they have the reports, they have the witness statements, they have the forensics, but they really want to see those witnesses testify on the stand, see what they're going to say, and that'll allow them to prepare their cross-examination and to poke holes in that testimony at the jury trial.
Instead, Romani expects the preliminary hearing to be prosecution heavy. He believes we could soon learn what prompted Kohberger to allegedly kill.
Or what we're going to hear a lot about during the preliminary hearing. And of course, evidence of the potential motive. There's been a lot of speculation that this was related to stalking of one or more of the victims and, what Bryan Kohberger did to message them on social media or contact them or go to their business where they work. I think that is generally what we're going to see come out at the prelim.
After the hearing, there's no definite timeline for a trial.
If the defense takes the position that they did in January, that they need more time, and they tell the court, Your Honor, we are not ready to present a defense in this case, the defendant's already in custody. If the judge were to force a trial before the defense is ready, that creates an issue on appeal.
And if and when a trial does begin, Romani expects a lengthy jury selection.
In the modern age with Law&Crime and social media, everyone in the world has heard about Bryan Kohberger. It's not like if you go to another part of Idaho, you're going to have jurors that haven't heard about this case. So I think those change of venue motions are a lot less important now than they might have been decades ago, with really kind of changes in technology and trials being broadcast live.
Whether it's learning about new DNA evidence, a victim's potential stalker, or even Kohberger's past, Romani believes the accused killer's strategic actions will take center stage in his coming court appearances.
One important thing to note is how careful Bryan Kohberger is. Here's someone who reportedly wears gloves when he goes to the grocery store. Obviously, he's very knowledgeable about our criminal justice system. He's a PhD student. Maybe he's watching Law&Crime. But typically in a murder scene like this, you're going to expect a lot more forensic evidence to be there. We talked about the cell site evidence. Most murderers don't have the knowledge and wherewithal to turn off their cell phone to make sure it doesn't track them. So as far as alleged murderers go, Bryan Kohberger is one of the most sophisticated I've seen in my more than 20 years of practice.
Kohberger's preliminary hearing is set for June 26th and is expected to last at least 5 days. Law&Crime Network will be in Idaho for the hearing to bring you the latest developments in the case. Reporting for Law&Crime Network, I'm Sierra Gillespie.